I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 30, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, and today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person and in the room, and remotely using the Zoom application. As usual, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code, which you can link to for a short awareness video. Pursuant to the Standing Orders 108.2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee is resuming its study of business risk management programs in Canada's agriculture sector. I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today from the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Andre Harp, is it Harp? Who is the chair, and Dustin Pike, Vice President, Government and Industry Relations. The Canadian Seed Growers Association, we have Douglas Miller. And Western Grain Elevator Association, we have Darren Amaranjan, I believe, the chairperson, and Tyler Borson, who's a consultant. You each have, as organizations, up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will proceed with a round of questions from the respected parties. I'd like to first welcome the Canadian Canola Growers Association. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very, very much for having us today. It's been a pleasure to appear before this committee. My name is Andre Harp. I am chair of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. I'm also joined by my colleague Dustin Pike, who's the Vice President of Government and Industry Relations. I am speaking to you today from Valhalla Centre, which is northwest of Grand Prairie, Alberta, where I operate a 5,000-acre grain farm, primarily growing canola and malt barley. The Canadian Canola Growers Association represents 40,000 canola farmers across Canada. We advocate on issues, policies, and programs that directly impact the success of their farms. In 2024, canola was once again the #1 source of crop revenue in Canada, generating $13 billion and accounting for 25% of total crop receipts. More broadly, the canola sector contributes over $43 billion annually to the Canadian economy and supports over 200,000 jobs across the value chain. This committee has an important task ahead in reviewing Canada's BRM programs for the upcoming policy framework. This work is both necessary and timely, as farmers are increasingly facing risks that extend well beyond traditional weather and price volatility. Since 2020, the global operating environment has fundamentally changed, leaving farmers to navigate one of the most uncertain and volatile periods in recent history. For today's grain farmer, it means confronting multiple interconnected shocks at the same time. Weather events, market closures, price volatility, high input costs, and geopolitics interact in ways that magnify risk and reduce farmers' control. BRM programs must evolve in both responsiveness and design to reflect this new reality. The situation in the Middle East is the latest example of how quickly and significantly my farm is impacted by things far beyond my control. Since January, the cost of fertilizer I need for spring planting has increased about 50%, which representing to myself is an additional $100,000. The cost of fuel has also increased significantly, as we've all witnessed, and together, the fuel and fertilizer costs represent approximately 50% of my input costs. The volatility and risks are real and very, very significant. I'll now turn over to my colleague Dustin to talk about our priorities at CCGA.
Thanks, Andre. To be effective, BRM programs must target risks that genuinely threaten farm viability. They should be affordable, avoid compliance requirements that create unnecessary barriers, remain responsive to current and emerging challenges, and provide farmers with meaningful choice and flexibility. As the next policy framework takes shape, it is critical that the investments in BRM programs are not diminished to fund other priorities. Without effective risk management tools, farmers' capacity to invest in their operations and the to adopt the technologies and practices that drive productivity and resilience will be significantly constrained. Canola farmers consistently identify agri-insurance as the cornerstone of Canada's BRM suite. Agri-insurance delivers essential production coverage, is predictable, widely subscribed, and delivered provincially, allowing for regional flexibility. Maintaining agri-insurance is the flagship program, also reduces pressure for large ad hoc programs by providing timely and reliable support when production losses occur. Agri-stability needs to be modernized to better serve farmers. With participation rates sitting at only about 30%, it's clear that many farmers have lost confidence in its effectiveness. The program is currently not timely, predictable, or responsive enough to address the realities producers face as trade disruptions and fails to accurately reflect farmers' margins when calculating support. When it comes to strategic initiatives, we recommend that all decisions be focused on growth, expanding the agriculture sector's economic output, market opportunities, and creating value through productivity gains. That's the growth part. Resilience, the second point, prioritizing the sector's ability to adapt to new threats. Innovation, advancing new technologies, industry-led and outcome-based. And the fourth and final component, efficiency, streamlining programs, reducing red tape, and delivering stronger outcomes. We're operating in a very different landscape than the last time this suite was reviewed. The decisions made in developing the next policy framework will be a defining role in shaping the future of Canadian agriculture amid increasing volatility and uncertainty. Getting this right is essential to ensuring Canadian farmers remain competitive and resilient over the long term. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Miller for 5 minutes.
Chair and the committee for the invitation to appear today. My name is Doug Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Seed Growers Association. CSGA is Canada's national seed crop certification authority, and we have partnered with the Government of Canada for over 100 years to be able to deliver Canada's seed certification program. Now, you may be wondering what seed certification has to do with business risk management. Well, consider this. 9 out of 10 bites of food start with seed. Seed is how plant breeding innovation gets to a farmer's field. Every variety that handles drought better, fights disease, or yields more under tough conditions reaches farmers through our seed certification system. When a farmer plants certified seed of a current proven variety, they are reducing the risk of production loss before a single dollar of BRM spending is needed. That makes seed certification a strategic risk management tool, not just another input. The reality is that too many Canadian farmers are planting varieties that are 10, 15, and sometimes even 20 years old. That is hurting their productivity and leaving them exposed to risks that their crops are simply not built to handle. And when things go sideways, and they do, BRM programs are left picking up the tab. Earlier this year, Nicholas Tyack, a researcher at the University of Saskatchewan, uncovered what slow variety adoption is costing Canadian farmers. His estimate, hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue each year, potentially approaching $1 billion in 2024 alone. The numbers that he exposed are striking. For context, the most widely grown Durham variety of wheat in Saskatchewan last year was CDC Transcend, which was released in 2012 and planted on approximately 1 million acres. For perspective, that's equivalent to almost 70% of the whole island of Prince Edward Island. The top red lentil variety was CDC Maxim, released in 2007. Staying on these older varieties is costing producers more than $10 per acre in lost yield revenue. In the forage sector, it's even worse. Many of the varieties being grown today were developed in the 1950s and 60s. This is not a niche problem, it's a national one, and BRM programs are quietly absorbing that cost year after year. Now, the data coming from what I've just kind of outlined here is coming from the Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Program. So the BRM system already is sitting on evidence of potential underlying problems, but what it does not have yet is a policy response. Plant breeding is one of the most direct tools we have to reduce the risks that drive farmers to BRM programs in the first place. Dr. Richard Gray of the University of Saskatchewan has shown that crop breeding investment returns roughly 30 times more value than BRM spending. That number and his research deserves this committee's attention, and I would encourage you to reach out to Dr. Gray about his findings. Canada, unfortunately, is moving in the wrong direction. The recent closure of AFC research stations is eroding our ability to develop new varieties and reducing farmers' access to better genetics. That means more production risk and, in the future, more pressure on BRM programs. The decision to close these stations will not be felt tomorrow, but by the next generation of Canadian farmers and future BRM programs. The varieties that we need in 2035 are being developed today, and these closures are disrupting our innovation pipeline. This also matters for trade. Canada is working hard to diversify our export markets, which is fantastic. And to compete globally, our crops need to perform. Farmers growing varieties from the early 2000s or the 1950s are not on the same footing as producers in countries that have built real incentives for adopting new genetics. This is not a farm issue, this is a competitiveness issue. Our recommendations are straightforward. First, protect public plant breeding investment moving forward. Treat it as an essential infrastructure for agricultural resilience, not a budget line item to cut. The 30-to-1 return on investment in this space is very well documented, and I know it's been discussed at this committee recently. Second, use BRM programs to encourage farmers to invest in newer genetics. If older varieties are a measurable driver of production risk, the BRM framework should respond to that. Even getting producers to update their genetics from every 10 years to 5 years would be significant. Third, ensure the timely completion of the CFIA's seed regulatory modernization process, which has been underway for almost 6 years now. BRM programs are essential for when things go sideways. However, there's a lot that we can do before it gets to that point, like adopting new varieties, which can lessen the burden on these programs moving forward. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to the Western Grain Elevator Association for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by saying that I'm a poor substitute for Mr. Amberongen, the chair of the WGA, who's been unexpectedly detained, but I'll do my best. As many of you know, the WGA is a national association of grain companies that handle over 90% of our country's bulk grain shipments. Collectively, they export in excess of $25 billion of grain annually. Canada's largest trading partners, unfortunately, are exploiting Canadian grain exporter vulnerability as levers toward political objectives due to the factors outside the grain sector's control. In response, exporters are being told to diversify markets. What that really means is selling more volume into lower value and higher risk markets, which is not sustainable given Canada's high cost, over-regulated, and chronically disrupted grain handling system. Furthermore, grain exporters already sell to over 80 countries, making our sector one of the most trade diversified sectors in the Canadian economy. There are 3 broad areas where Canada's federal government can provide assistance to grain exporters in managing its business risk. 1, improving business risk management tools for exporters. 2, ensuring supply chains run smoothly. And 3, removing unnecessary red tape and reducing government costs. With respect to the key theme of this meeting on improving business risk management, this committee has heard extensively from the agricultural sector on how its exporters have borne the brunt of fluctuating political relations with our major bilateral trading partners, notably China. Exporters have no ability currently to manage these risks that have resulted in massive financial losses. Unlike other sectors, including automotive, steel, and aluminum businesses, Ottawa has left grain exporters to take those losses without any further consideration. This is grossly unfair. This is a business risk that has been wholly generated by government. Government should therefore be looking to help grain exporters mitigate those risks. In 2025 alone, Canadian grain exporters experienced direct contractual losses of approximately 60 million Canadian dollars and costs from broader grain market adjustments in the range of 144 to 384 million, all due to geopolitical trade tensions. Grain companies need predictable, consistent, and easily accessible business risk management solutions where a foreign government announces or implements an agricultural trade barrier. In our view, tax-based solutions are the most elegant as they allow exporters to know immediately if their situation would be covered or not. For example, we think a foreign political trade barrier tax credit for agricultural exporters could be created. It could be a refundable tax credit to offset verifiable costs incurred to respond to or mitigate the political trade barrier in question. Examples of these costs include demurrage fees, carrying costs, and the price differential for distressed sales. Additionally, subsidization of contract default insurance could also help exporters deal with diversifying to riskier geographies with riskier customers. EDC does not provide political risk insurance. It does not provide insurance on possible erosion of contract prices on commodities due to political trade barriers, nor does it intend on making program adjustments to cover the risks we've identified. As a result, subsidization of private sector insurance for contract defaults may be the only reasonable avenue to reduce contract default risk. These solutions would mitigate exporter company risk and help keep agricultural products moving, leading up to and during geopolitical disruptions, which in turn could help to hold prices steady at farm gate, as well as reduce demurrage, carrying costs, and other penalties that could be attributed to the political trade barrier in play. On the second theme on removing unnecessary red tape, perhaps this is the simplest way of enhancing competitiveness to drive trade diversification and better export risk management, simply by making government rules less costly to business. The WGA has submitted a brief to this committee during your discussion of that topic. We will not duplicate our comments there. We think all of those recommendations remain relevant today. With respect to the third theme, ensuring supply chains run smoothly, Canada's ability to compete in global markets hinges on our ability to move grain from the vast interior of our country to tidewater ports. Understandably, many things can stand in our way to do that successfully. With respect to labor, the reoccurring and chronic threat of railway and port work stoppages jeopardizes our ability to get product to market and adds risk to the transaction. A recent study done by Anderson Economic Group quantifies the economic impacts of transportation labor disruptions on the Canadian grain sector. A one-week work stoppage on either railway costs approximately $250 million per week, which doubles if both go on strike at the same time as we saw in 2014. With respect to infrastructure, the major trade enabling infrastructure...
5 minutes. I'll just let you wrap up.
Thank you.
Really quickly.
The major trade enabling projects announced so far do not reflect anything beneficial to the grain sector. In conclusion, most of the geopolitical trade risks and disruptions experienced by the grain sector are connected to federal government political decisions regarding bilateral relationships. The federal government has all the levers at its disposal to help grain exporters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll go to the Conservatives for 6 minutes. Mr. Barlow.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Miller, I wanted to start with you, and you made some comments regarding new seed certification. And we had Lori Oatway from the Western Crop Innovation appear before this committee. We were talking about the research center closure specifically. And she made some comments that as a result of these closures, without AAFC being a co-op partner on the research, it could significantly hamper the certification of new varieties because CFIA asks that AAFC be a partner in that research. So now with these closures, you are losing one of the most critical publicly funded partners. Can you just comment on what the ramifications of that could be, as you're already talking about how difficult it is to get new seeds certified?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. When we look at the AFC research closures, the seed sector is disproportionately impacted by those cuts. It is about releasing varieties, but it's also about the maintenance of those varieties. About 20 to 25% of the seed that we certify in this country, and Canada has one of the world's largest seed certification systems globally, 20 to 25% has flown through Indian Head Research Farm at one point in its production cycle. We've heard from Ag Canada desire to maybe move that site to Saskatoon. That's going to create some gaps there that are really going to impact our ability to have higher generation breeder seed available, which is really the foundation of our system. Ms. Oatway, I watched her testimony, and yes, definitely the points that she made there about impacts to our breeding and testing and all that are definitely true. It's really, we're losing a network. Then the network effect is really real here. It's not just Ag Canada that is being impacted here, but it's all the smaller research stations that rely on these sites to be able to test their varieties.
Is there a possible way, you talked about some varieties are being used that are from, the 60s or, 15, 20 years ago. we need to find a way for producers to be embracing new varieties. But if new varieties aren't coming online as a result of these closures, how much further behind is that going to put Canadian farmers in terms of economic viability and competitiveness?
Very, very far behind. And I will also say that some of the adoption of these newer varieties, it's very crop kind dependent. We look at the canola sector, we see rapid adoption of new varieties, but in other sectors like in malt barley, where the brewsters and the maltsters are really asking for specific older varieties, it hurts the forward pull of these newer varieties here, but absolutely there will be some severe impacts.
Mr. Miller, we now have the information from the Deputy Minister. We asked what due diligence was done by AAFC in the closure of these research stations. And now we're understanding that the numbers are quite frustrating when you see it's going to save $27 million next year, up to $230 million over the next decade. To put that in perspective, they have just put the Liberal government has put another $300 million into the off-CAF program, so $700 million total. That would pay for these research centers to remain open and having actual impact on farmers on the ground. If you were to ask your members, in their opinion, which program would you prefer the government to be funding, what do you think their response would be?
Our members have made it very loud and clear that they support public plant breeding and would like to see money invested in that space.
Thank you. I would like to ask the same question to Mr. Harp and Mr. Pike. Now seeing the numbers that are going to be saved by the closure of these research centers, but also understanding the consequences of these closures, we're trying to give the government an off-ramp here to find savings elsewhere in programs that aren't having the same impact as these research centers and experimental farms. From the canola perspective, would you prefer to see the funds invested in research and innovation or in the off-CAF program?
Well, maybe I'll answer that, Mr. Barlow. At the end of the day, it gets back to research is key. Whether, we have a lot of private research that goes into the canola seed, but, there's a lot of other, we have a lot of other issues that need research. And I'll go research is key.
Well, I find that interesting that both of those groups made that answer, as I'm sure all of us did prior to the election last year. We asked agriculture groups what their number one priority would be, and the number one priority, almost unanimously, was ensuring that AAFC's number one focus was research and innovation. So I just find it very frustrating, let's say, that the first act by this government is to close research and innovation centers and experimental farms, laying off dozens, hundreds of staff and certainly dozens of scientists and researchers. Maybe a quick question to Mr. Bjornson. You didn't touch on it, but maybe some of the red tape in terms of double inspection of grain and the longer grain elevator license process and the impact that's having.
20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. Certainly the duplication of the inspection of grain that's bound for offshore markets is a major frustration for us. We think it's costing the entire sector over $40 million. Grain that's destined to the U.S., Mexico by rail and containers is not inspected mandatorily by the Canadian Grain Commission, and we think this is a antiquated regulation that's in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to the Liberals for 6 minutes. Mr. Connors.
Hello, can you hear me?
You're good.
Thank you to all the witnesses for coming today, and thank you for your work in feeding Canadians and the world. My first question is to Mr. Pike. You mentioned in your opening remarks that the agri-stability program needs to be modernized. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and how your industry see it, what needs to be done in order to modernize it?
Yes, thank you for the question. Very important component. As I mentioned in my preamble, agri-insurance is basically the cornerstone program within the BRM suite. It's predictable, it's timely, it's bankable, it has high enrollment of 70%, but agri-stability has been lagging behind. With enrollment of only about 30%, farmers have lost a lot of confidence in that regard. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And we think that it can take on a little bit of a different direction, a little bit different priority, but one that meets the challenges of today. And that's global uncertainty, where unfortunately the poster organization for trade disruption, you've seen the China tariffs. So we think that there's an opportunity to revamp agri-stability to respond to these big global shifts, these big trade uncertainties that we see that affects commodity organizations, to a large extent. So that's where we think the direction should be from a cost recovery point of view, from the trade uncertainty.
Thank you very much. And I know that you're here representing the Canola Association. Do you think it's in other sectors as well, like the vegetable industry and other commodities within the agricultural industry?
Well, I'd if we're starting the conversation a little bit, from this side, I know there's another organization coming in here in the second hour that will, reflect that sentiment. I'd like to see, more of that conversation with the other commodity groups to see if this is an avenue, to bolster participation rates within the agri-stability program. So, yeah, I would like to see that expanded for sure.
Thank you very much. My next question is for the Western Grain Association. You spoke about transportation issues that affect your association and your sector. How can this be incorporated, or how can it be improved under the new BRM programs, suite of programs, or in the next policy framework to improve that? Or is this something that should be outside of BRM?
Thank you very much for the question. We think that generally the government should be very concerned about business competitiveness. And there's a number of ways in which government can respond to that. BRM is one. We've highlighted a couple of others in addition to our BRM ideas on, a tax credit that responds to foreign political trade barriers. We also think that the government has a role to play in reducing regulatory red tape, for example, of which there are several port-related issues on the transportation side, such as the fumigation rules is a relatively easy fix. We're the only jurisdiction that requires vessels to sit for 24 hours after it's fumigated, unlike every other jurisdiction that's out there. Port rent in the Port of Vancouver has exploded over the last several years. Some terminals are experiencing increases year over year of 30 to 40%. We're looking at situations in licensing of port terminals and other inland elevators that takes place on an annual basis that we think could move to every 5 years. So those are relatively simple fixes, MP Connors, that we think could be implemented alongside our ideas on BRM.
You also mentioned and used the term export risk management. Would that be similar? Can you just elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Certainly. This is really the key point that we wanted to present to the committee today. And that is when you have a foreign country that's responding to a geopolitical tension with Canada. So let me take the example of China. One day after Canada announced the tariffs on electric vehicles, China announced that it was doing an anti-dumping investigation on canola. And immediately we had Chinese customers calling us saying, can you get the boats of canola as fast as possible to us? And so what we had to do was prioritize canola vessels before the November 8th deadline to respond to the anti-dumping investigation, because we had no foresight into what might happen after that. And so what happened was we ended up asking, proverbially, boats that were supposed to load with wheat or barley or peas or other commodities to do donuts in the Pacific while we loaded as many canola boats as possible. But we were paying for the costs of those boats waiting to be loaded because we were trying to prioritize the canola boats. So that's an example of an export risk that we had no ability to manage whatsoever, that we think the government could look at some business risk management tools to help exporters specifically when we're running into challenges of this nature.
We'll go to Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes.
Président, merci pour vos déclarations.
Chair, thank you for your statements. There's something interesting that comes out of what was mentioned this morning. Mr. Miller, I would like to begin with you with a question. The Standards Bureau of Canada finished its activities on April 1, 2026, and the Bureau was responsible for developing assessment of standards on biologics and GMOs. And this raises important questions on the quality and follow-up of the available standards. In your opinion, is the government on the wrong track? Will this have an impact on you? And should something be done about that Bureau quickly?
Understood your question. This is about GMO labeling and organic standards?
Yep.
So from our organization's perspective, it's important that Canadian producers have access to all the tools in the toolbox. And as we approach our standards making authority and the work that we do, it's very much agnostic to that. It's about providing an enabling framework. So we have been a participant around the table there, but we are not active participants around that, so I wouldn't be able to comment to that. But at Seed Growers, we do have a lot of transparency measures in place. Right now, we are piloting digital seed tags. So the mark of our sector is this blue tag, and the blue tag hasn't changed a lot in 120 years. It's sometimes handwritten, sometimes the dot matrix. But what we've done now is embedded a QR code into them so that the end user can be able to scan them and then to be able to get more insights into how that variety was produced. If it was a gene-edited variety or GMO, that's all possible in the future. And so we're piloting that to be able to respond to certain segments that want that additional transparency in their seed purchases.
Intéressant. Ce matin, je recevais à mon bureau.
Interesting. This morning in my office, we received some information, and there are associations of, for example, specialized flowers and also Quebec cattle producers, and they all talk to me about the importance of research, which is done in many places. And at Swift Current, there's a biological and regenerative research station that is being closed, and we've heard through the grapevine that the current closing practices will bring to an end or bring to risk the research, because we have people who are leaving their jobs more quickly, of course. So why would the government speed up the closing of those research programs, and what are the risks to cut off those research programs? And will we lose expertise and thousands of hours of research because of an effort to quickly close things down? What will be the impacts on research underway, and does this affect you in particular?
So whenever the AFC closures were announced, CSJ was very quick to be able to bring together over 80 impacted stakeholders to be able to get a sense of what was at stake, so we would have a common fact-based understanding of what was going on. And the closures to the long-standing organic trials were definitely something that was brought forward, and it was a very big concern to the producer groups and the producers around the table that rely on those trials to be able to do that, because you just can't pick up multi-year production sites and move it to Saskatoon. That's just not happening. So once those research stations close, we definitely lose that capacity. And there is no guarantee that moving forward that these are going to be still in the agriculture sector, going through the government's surplus process. We don't know who's going to end up with these. Whenever we're looking at these programs that are being closed, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the germplasm. So this is kind of the gene banks that are at all these facilities. that Canadian producers and Canadian taxpayers have invested millions of dollars in developing and maintaining over the years. So that's definitely a concern. There's a common joke here that once they close, just go to the back dumpster and be able to make sure that germplasm is being kept. That is absolutely something that we should not have happen. So whenever these stations are closing, we need to be able to have more advanced notice. I think back to 2012 and to the Deficit Action Reduction Plan. I don't look like maybe I was around back then, but I was. And there were some big cuts to the seed sector. We had to privatize our crop inspection model. Government of Canada was doing that work for us for over 100 years, and they said, we're not going to do that moving forward. But they gave us 18-month window to be able to get it right and to be able to have a plan. They gave us some seed money to be able to build a best-in-class digital system called SeedCert. And we're able to get through it. We were able to reimagine how we do our processes. But with the current leeway we have, we don't have that ability to reimagine what's possible. And I think that if we had the ability to say, we're going to close these stations in 3 years, as tough as that would have been, we could have come up with a plan to say, here's how we can do it in a new way. Here's how we can make a uniquely made in Canada solution. But unfortunately, with the current timelines that we have, that's lost. The technicians, I don't know what's happening with those, but maybe there's not research scientists being impacted, but the technicians that are responsible for doing the day-to-day work that help bring that science to life, we're losing them, and that once they're gone and the land is gone, it's really hard to get back. Its critical capacity will never get back again.
I would also like to hear you on, there are cuts, but also the importance of knowing about diversity of Canadian soils. And I'll come back on the second round for that. Thank you, Chair.
Very much. Mr. Epp, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing. The present agricultural policy framework has 5 pillars in it. And we've heard from the importance of the BRM, business risk management, which I'm about to get into the weeds on. But before I go there, one of the other pillars is the science and innovation, and obviously the ag research station closures touch on that, are important to that. We've heard from my colleagues' questions and our previous study that we're wrapping up the importance of that. There are 3 other pillars that are sometimes not as broadly supported. So the question I want to get on the record from at least 2 of the groups here today, the concept of cross-compliance, of tying the importance of the other pillars, whether they're supported or not, to the BRM. What is your organization's position on that? I'll begin with Mr. Pike or Mr. Harp.
Yeah, I can kick it off. Quite simply, end cross-compliance. This, in our view, erodes the effectiveness of BRM programming when you require this cross-compliance. BRM needs to focus on covering loss.
That, Mr. Miller?
Unfortunately, that is outside of my purview, and I wouldn't be able to comment on that.
Okay, so now getting right into the business risk management programs, we heard the testimony that agri-insurance is the cornerstone of that. I've heard that from other groups as well, and the concerns, as I hear them, are largely focused around agri-stability. Would that be an accurate statement, Mr. Pike?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Diving into that a bit more, given the concerns that have been building, would you envision, and I believe this came in your testimony, that what we're looking for now are tweaks or major overhauls?
Yeah, well, I could kick things off again, and perhaps I'll pass it along to Andre for some more on-farm application reference. But it's very hard to access for our guys. As I mentioned in the preamble, it's a 30% participation rate. It's the way the program is designed doesn't support grains and oilseed farmers. Because they have huge capital investments in equipment, land, the way the margins are calculated and the trigger is organized, many guys unfortunately just aren't able to take advantage of it. So I would say regardless, these tweaks still could be probably classified as a major overhaul because there's a lot of them. You talk about red tape reduction as well. It's not responsive to meet the needs of the current global threats out there. The payments come late, even if you're able to get something from it. So as I mentioned, a different course we think should be explored, and how we can utilize the program's capacity to manage income stabilization for trade threats.
If I can push you a bit on that, do you have any specific directions then that agri-stability should go? I mean, we talk about various coverage levels. We're all aware of the low enrollment level, the complexity, the lack of bankfulness. But do you have any specifics go there? And let me follow up a question with that. If some of that predictability and ease of administration were addressed, A, would you think producers would support it a bit more? And B, would they consider investing more into that program if they had more confidence that their margins were to be addressed in a timely manner, margin pitfalls were to be addressed in a timely manner?
Yeah, they might.
So,
go ahead on there, Andre.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to interject a little bit. I'm going to use an example right now, which I think is really timely for my farm. I've been enrolled in ag stability for years, and actually for the last 2 years, we were actually looking at getting out of it. It's very costly because of what you've talked before about cross compliance and making sure that your I's are dotted, and T's are crossed. It's costing me $5,000 to $7,000 a year for to have my accountant go through it. So there's the number one issue. It's very, very costly because the government wants things done right. I don't blame them for that, but it gets back to, when we have an inventory that is not necessarily it's not scaled. It's not weighed all the time.
Sorry to interrupt. I hear you on those concerns. Insurance programs work. If margins were insured, is that a concept that you would support?
Oh, very absolutely. I would definitely look at it. Getting back to you're talking about tweaking ag stability.
Sir. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
We're going to go to MP Harrison. Sorry about that. MP Harrison.
Thank you. Mr. Harper, if you'd like to finish your comments, because my line of questioning is in line with Mr. Epson's to Mr. Pike. I'll be coming back as well with ag stability, and more specifically, because we hear all the time red tape reduction over and over, but we need more specifics to that, because how do we attack these issues if we don't specifically have the voices of producers and what they're facing? The ag stability issue is not foreign to me. I've never enrolled in ag stability. My neighbors have, and they've never, it's not a benefit to them. So Mr. Harp, if you continue with your answer, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Basically, yes, there is some tweaking to do that can actually do some major benefits to ag stability. The trigger rate for it, basically how it pays out. One of the issues I've had, it gets back, over the past few years, we've had 4 or 5 years of what I would call extended drought. The trouble is, and that rolls down our average. So basically, the example I was going to use is when we were, kept out of China over the winter time, we had an extreme loss of canola. But because of my averages being brought down, that didn't trigger a payment. So, it's got to be more responsive, because the insurance side is for the productivity, for the environmental part of it. But if the ag stability needs to be more responsive to, basically drops that are outside of our control for what we sell our products for. And over the winter, we went through $15 bushel canola down to $12. That's a drop, and that's a sudden drop. And it didn't. I have yet to talk to anybody that's enrolled in ag stability that actually worked, or that they're getting payments for that.
Thank you. And to Mr. Pike, so you said there's 30% enrollment for ag stability, which that's incredibly low. Do you have anything specifically with reduction of the complexity of it for your producers?
Yeah, no, I would say we're getting that together in consultation with our farmer membership. There's obviously a lot of work here to set the signals right now, leading up to the FPT in July, where that framework, I think, is going to be reinforced. And, leading up to that process, we're speaking with, government folks as well. I think that NPAC, could potentially play a part in this. But I don't have explicit, ask for you right now, or examples for you right now, but that's something we can get together and provide a report to the committee.
Thank you. To Mr. Miller, when it comes to the BRM programs, what changes would you like to see and what gaps exist within them?
Yeah, so one example would be, how do we encourage more adoption of new genetics? And so when we look at things like agri-insurance, there is the provincial programs, they do have increased premiums for producers of certified seed. But there is only one jurisdiction in Canada that really that rewards producers from using certified seed, and that is Quebec. And so if there is that double-sided coin that could be added to a program like agri-insurance, I think that would be quite beneficial.
Okay, thank you. And then to Western Grain Association, same question.
Yeah, we'd love to have a business risk management tool. We've come up with an idea of using a tax credit, and I can tell you why a tax credit. I think many of my colleagues around the table would tell you that applications are laborious. The outcome isn't certain. There's red tape involved with that. It's the inconsistency and the unpredictability of an application to a program that doesn't work for exporters that are making in-the-moment decisions about whether or not the boat that's on its way from Canada to China needs to go to Bangladesh or Pakistan, or we have to resell to Europe. So those are the sorts of on-the-spot decisions we need. A tax credit provides predictability and consistency. A business can make that decision on the spot and know, roughly speaking, whether or not they would qualify or not for the tax credit, as opposed to a program that becomes much more complex. So that would be our primary ask for a new business risk management tool to help agri-food exporters. And by the way, we don't believe that this is just something that would work for grain exporters. We think it would work for all agri-food exporters. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to the Bloc Québécois for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Miller, of course, seed requires a great deal of research because its use in different soils can vary, whether it's the impact of the climate, the hours of sunlight, and other things. And in a context where research is being cut back, how do you operate? Does that have any impact, those closings, insofar as you need to know how the different additives respond in different soils? How are you going to offset the closing of these research centers?
Yes, seed production is highly regional. Canada is a massive country with diverse ecosystems, and what works in Swift Current does not work down the highway and there. So whenever we look at these cuts, what we're really losing is the ability to test these varieties where producers are going to be growing them. I think I've heard that we're going to have a gap within our testing network of about 650 kilometers. That might not seem like a big amount of kilometers, but there's a huge amount of variability within that production zone. And so what we're asking now is farmers to be able to test varieties that aren't necessarily adapted for their regions to be able to do it. So the risk is being brought down to the producer. I think whenever I look longer term, I think there's a real risk that we face as a country where we're asking Canadian farmers to potentially produce varieties that aren't necessarily bred for Canadian producers. An example of this that's already kind of happening in real time would be in the Maritimes, where there's not a lot of R&D happening in seed variety development, and seed is being imported in from Quebec and Ontario, and yes, those are good varieties, but they're not specifically bred for those environments, so we're not optimizing for that. So I think that is the longer term. It's kind of what do we want to be able to do? Do we want to be able to ship all of our seed in from Michigan? It's great for a Michigan producer in the corn belt, but it's probably not great for the Ontario hybrid corn growers. So I think there's some fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves about what we want from food sovereignty, because it all starts with seed.
Merci. Mon temps a été écoulé. Merci.
You're good? Okay. Next, we'll go to the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Mr. Bexley? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate and welcome witnesses today, and welcome to my colleagues. I wanted to kind of frame this next round of questioning. There are multiple aspects to business risk management, but weather, logistics, geopolitics. We've kind of touched on all these points. And a healthy industry in the first place is kind of a very important pillar of that, and we've also sort of alluded to that. But I want to go to the logistics and geopolitics part, and perhaps Mr. Bjornsson, if you could address this. I wonder, the Prime Minister said canola tariffs were a priority with China and getting those removed and reestablishing the canola trade with China. And at the same time, the Prime Minister says U.S. trade with the U.S. is a weakness. But the U.S. is geographically attached to Canada. I mean, we're never going to avoid that. It's by far the largest trading partner we have. How does that, square off with the circumstance we have in business risk management programs when we should be getting better trade relationships across the U.S. border?
Thank you very much for the question. From the grain elevator's perspective, it's the U.S. and China and other markets. It's not one or the other. We know that the United States is by far our strongest trading partner. We need it to be that way for many, many years to come. But we also need access to major demand centers like China. It's very difficult to say that you're going to replace one of the two of those major markets with 30 other countries. That's a very difficult task to do that. And that's why it's critical that it's the U.S. and China in Canada's trade relations, that those remain on the forefront. It's very, very critical.
So I guess what I'm getting at, maybe, and perhaps Dustin and Andre, you could comment on this, that, how reliable is China as a trading partner? And when we're considering business risk management, putting all your eggs in one basket, as you alluded to, right? We need all 30 others, but we got these two great big ones, and maybe the EU too, but we're like picking and choosing which one we want to partner with to the exclusion of the other. We can't do that. We have to be to all comers, right? So how does that impact the business risk management climate? And are there any adaptations in the systems that we have today that account for that? Government policy being one of the major business risks that we see.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for go ahead there, Andre. Yeah.
Okay. No, sorry. I guess one thing I would say, it gets back to when you really depend on different trade partners, you always put yourself at risk. And I really have enjoyed the opportunity we have with canola with the United States. China, it also has been in the past very, very good. But, one of the things, and we do recognize that, we can't depend on any one country. Politics has changed. Geopolitics has changed. But, that's one of the things we have really been advocating. You know what? We need to start using what we grow in Canada. We need to start using it in Canada. Recently I was just in Ottawa talking to, lots of people about, we need to really look at our biofuel market because it is a really good place. We need to start using it in Canada because then we don't have to depend on either country as much as we have been. But right now it's been really good. We've really been enjoying the trade.
Thank you. That leads me to back to a point that's already been not belabored, but not spoken hard enough, is the aspects of research that are required to make the pivot that you're talking about. And that if we don't have the capacity domestically to do that, we cannot rely on other people to carry our water for us. That we have to get it. I'd like to turn a little bit more to business risk management related to reliability up front. I just recently introduced the Farm Act, B273. Now, how does that sort of approach to the industry impact business risk management in terms of having a healthy industry to start with?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple quick comments. And we're very appreciative of your private members bill 273. We put out a public release. It's obviously a very good signal to what our farmers do, and we hope to see that make some movement through the House. Of course, I want to acknowledge a couple of years ago, MP Cody Bloss introducing his version, and where we were publicly supportive of that as well. And we're very much glad to see you bolster it by including a fertilizer component as well. Obviously, when the situation that we're in. Andre talked about increased fertilizer prices. We need that kind of stuff. And it's very good timing, too. I didn't get a chance to talk about research stations. And although Andre mentioned the importance of research for farmers, it's very timely, too, right? Like, I think it was MP Lemire who characterized it as impacts, right? We've
I have to stop you there. We'll go to the Liberals. I gave an extra 20 seconds. I gave an extra 20 seconds. I'm going to go to the Liberals for the last 5 minutes. I gave an extra 20. MP Chatel, I apologize. It's my job. MP Chatel, go ahead, 5 minutes.
Oui, merci beaucoup à nos témoins.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here for this important study on the upcoming strategic partnership with the provinces and territories. This comes at a time in our history when we are experiencing economic upheaval, which you already mentioned, and it's not easy to deal with. But we have to focus on what we can control and grow our economy and make sure, and the Prime Minister has discussed this, that we need to have a strategy for food security in Canada. And as a pillar of this, of course, we have agreements with the provinces on risk management programs. So thank you for being here for this important topic. Mr. Miller, I would like to begin with you because I'm really interested in hearing your proposal. And if you could send it, a more detailed copy of it in writing to the committee, it would be highly appreciated. Regarding the agri-insurance program and the proposal to say we can reduce the premiums for those who adopt and renew a variety, a little bit like alongside of what's being done in Quebec. Could you explain more to us how that works? And could you explain what are the obstacles that could arise or who would be opposed to a proposal such as that?
Well, thank you for your question. Absolutely, we can definitely follow up with some additional information. And this information, this research is really starting to really unfold. I talked about the research coming out of the University of Saskatchewan, and this is like hot off the press. And this is going to kick off like a 3-year project that's kind of underway. So that project is underway. It is looking for funding to be able to get it over the hump there, so hopefully there's an ability to access some funding there. But when it comes to leveraging new varieties, this is not a new concept. We've always been talking about as a sector, how do we increase the adoption rate of certified seed? And there's a lot of different factors that are in place here. And we release in Canada, we have such a strong focus on quality that we're releasing certified seed that is like 99.7% pure. So farmers, and especially in a self-pollinated crop kind, they're able to use that year in, year out. And we don't want to change that. Things like farmers' privilege and farmers' right to save seed, we're not looking to change that. But there is the ability to be able to ensure that they have that investment pipeline, that they're able to keep that innovation pipeline going. Tyler talked about tax credits, and this is something that the seed sector looked at in 2008, 2007. They did a study on what would a tax credit look like to be able to incentivize the use of certified seed credits. And there's quite an extensive research done there that it said for every tax dollar that the government gives up, that forgoes, that it would actually generate $2 to $3 worth of increased productivity in terms of the overall economy. So there's some things that we can dust off and be able to share with you. But I think there's an opportunity for us to be able to. This is not a testimony that seed growers would normally give, right? Because we are a co-regulator with the Government of Canada. But you reached out and said, "Do you want to talk about business risk management?" And we said, "Absolutely. This is a great opportunity to talk about what we do. We don't really get that opportunity." So I will have my team definitely reach out to share that information with the clerk. Today is actually my last day with the organization, and so the next people will be able to kind of keep it going for you. But we'll be sure to be in touch.
Et merci pour tout votre excellent travail.
Thank you for all your great work over the years. Thank you. Mr. Bjornsson, along the same line of thinking, I'm intrigued by your proposal for a tax credit. And in fact, I like tax credits. I think it's a good way to lighten the burden for a program. it tremendously reduces the red tape, and we always try to be more effective. You're proposing this for the program with the associated costs connected with trade disruption. And you mentioned the example of a few costs, but I think that the committee would benefit greatly from a more detailed document in writing, because in 30 seconds you won't have time to give us a full answer. But perhaps you could send in your proposal in a more detailed version to explain what form a tax credit could take. You talked about it being a reimbursable tax credit for those who don't have a profit in 1 year, but also for other programs as well that will be used this summer, or studied this summer, rather.
Very much, and that concludes our 3 rounds. Mr. Miller, you said it was your last day as the executive director?
It is, yes.
Okay, well, thank you for all the work you've done.
Thank you.
On behalf of the committee. Yeah. Okay, we'll take a short break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Our way back, we have had a bit of a technical issue with Mr. McLeod from the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association, where our technicians are on the line with him now to try to repair that so that he can provide his testimony and participate in the committee. If not, we may have to try to invite Mr. McLeod back for another meeting. But in the interim, we will proceed, and hopefully they get it resolved. So I call this meeting back to order, colleagues. I would like to take a few minute for some comments to our new witnesses, and certainly we have a couple that have never been with us before. Mr. Burrows, welcome. But please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking or asking a question directly by a member. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those who are on a Zoom or a teleconference, at the bottom of the screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation. And a reminder of everyone that all comments should be through the chair. Pursuant to the Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by this committee, the committee is resuming the study of business risk management programs in Canada's agricultural sector. I would like to now welcome our witnesses here today. From the Conseil Québécois des Plants Foragers, Vincent Odette is the chair. Welcome. Thank you very much. From Grain Growers of Canada, Bruce Burrows and Kate Sauser, Policy Manager and Executive Director. And also, as I mentioned, we have Cedric McLeod, the Executive Director of the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. To our witnesses, you'll each have up to 5 minutes to make your presentation, followed by questions from our committee members. We will now start with Mr. Odette. You have 5 minutes, please.
My name is Vincent Audet, and I represent the Conseil Québécois des Plants Foragers, an organization that brings together the entire Quebec forage sector, encompassing the areas of production, harvesting, storage, processing, and marketing. Perennial forage crops account for nearly half of the cultivated land in Quebec. They form the basis of the feed for many livestock operations that are essential to our food self-sufficiency. Behind these sectors are thousands of agricultural businesses, the vast majority of which are family-owned SMEs present in all regions, including remote regions. The livestock industry alone is projected to generate a GDP of about $2 billion for Quebec by 2024. We can also add another $2 billion for meat processing and another $1.3 billion for milk processing. In this context, business risk management programs are essential, particularly when it comes to dealing with weather-related risks, which will intensify with climate change. First of all, these programs must cover a wider range of risks, from pasture land establishment through to harvest. A pasture that fails to establish properly, a harsh winter, excessive water, or a drought can jeopardize the profitability of an SME long before the final yield is known. Secondly, we need to better measure what we want to ensure. In forage crops, yield measurement remains a crucial issue. Every producer should be able to protect their yields. Yield measurement must be made simple, accessible, and widespread enough that it can be used on a large scale on farms. This requires better support for technological tools, monitoring, and data collection. We also believe that the capacity to produce surpluses in good years should be encouraged to better weather the bad ones. Making hay surpluses more economically attractive would allow for the creation of strategic reserves useful during drought or difficult years. These regional surpluses could also be made available to assist regions facing shortages. Plans should be put in place to respond quickly when a crisis looms. Programs must also recognize that the best risk management is often prevention. Perennial forage crops provide important ecosystem services, particularly by improving soil health and sequestering carbon. These benefits reduce long-term risks by increasing the resiliency of the entire agricultural system. They should be more widely recognized and potentially better compensated to make perennial forage crops an obvious business choice for producers. Finally, we cannot talk about prevention without discussing research. We need solutions tailored to the realities faced by the thousands of SMEs we mentioned earlier, both in today's climate and in the future climate. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Quebec Research Centre, whose closure was recently announced, played a vital role in research on perennial forage crops and soil health, as well as in knowledge transfer, which has led to the adoption in the field of dozens of innovative practices tailored to the realities of producers across all regions. This centre made concrete contributions to improving the yield, nutritional value, and vitality of perennial forage plants through the development of cultivation methods and genetic improvement. For example, researcher Annie Claessens, whose position was eliminated, had developed grass varieties offering 15% higher yields and alfalfa varieties providing 20% more energy for animals. These varieties could have been in our fields in the coming years. Researcher Marie-Noëlle Thivière, whose position was also cut, was working on the resiliency of cropping systems with a particular focus on plant roots. She had recently demonstrated that because of their deep roots, perennial forage plants lead to increased productivity in the corn and soybeans that follow them in the crop rotation, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a third and reducing nitrogen pollution of groundwater by half. These two researchers effectively communicated their findings and gave dozens of presentations each year to agronomists and agricultural producers. This expertise should be maintained because it is essential to adapt the forage sector and consequently the dairy and beef sectors to climate change. By continuing this research, we strengthen farm resilience and reduce the strain on risk management programs. Thus, these programs must not only compensate for losses after the fact, they must also support agricultural systems that reduce risk at the source. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Odette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Odette.
Now to Mr. Burrows or Ms. Sauser, who would take the floor for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Bonjour, député. My name is Bruce Burrows, and I'm the Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada. In contrast to previous witness, I just started actually a couple of days ago. So please bear with me, and this is one reason why joining me today is our in-house expert and farmer herself, Kate Sauser, Manager Policy. She's here to keep me out of trouble, I hope. Aussi, je vous demande un peu de...
I would also like to ask for your indulgence. I will be making my comments in English.
Growers of Canada represents over 100,000 producers through our 15 national, provincial, and regional grower organizations. Together, our members steward more than 120 million acres of farmland and produce crops that feed Canadians and customers in over 160 countries, generating approximately $45 billion in export value. 70% of our production is exported. This study comes at a particularly important moment for grain farmers. Across much of the country, seeding is already underway or soon about to begin. At the start of every season, farmers make some of the largest financial commitments of the year, often before a single crop is in the ground. According to Farm Credit Canada, producers are expected to invest approximately $22.5 billion in crop inputs for this season alone, which includes seeds, of course, fertilizers, pesticides. This represents one of the most significant annual, therefore regular, private sector investment in Canada, made months before any revenue is realized. Talking about risk. Input costs remain elevated, margins are tight, and producers are increasingly exposed to risks far outside their control. Those risks are no longer limited to weather or production. Farmers are now navigating geopolitical disruptions, trade uncertainty, supply chain instability. Existing business risk management programs were not designed for this environment. That is exactly why this study matters. Recent tariffs affecting Canadian ag exports, including measures targeting canola and other commodities, illustrate how quickly market access can change and how significant the financial consequences can be at the farm level. Member producers have reported losses of approximately $1 to $2 per bushel just due to geopolitical disputes, which can translate into six-figure impacts on individual farm operations. When shocks like these occur, producers need BRM programs. and they have to be responsive, they have to be predictable, and capable of stabilizing operations through uncertainty. As governments begin preparing for the next FPT framework, covering 28 to 32 or 33, this is an opportunity to ensure BRM programming reflects a multitude of risks that farmers are now facing today, and those are likely to be faced in the future. I'll make 4 points quickly and then conclude. First, it's essential that existing core programs remain strong. Agri-insurance continues to be the foundation of risk management for grain farmers, no question about it. It's widely used, it's regionally responsive, and delivers support when producers need it most. The current cost-sharing model between governments and producers is working and should be maintained. Protecting the integrity and accessibility of agri-insurance must remain a priority. Second, BRM programs must better reflect emerging risks beyond production losses. Trade disruptions, as I just mentioned, the geopolitical tensions, transportation interruptions, and regulatory uncertainty can all have significant financial consequences for producers, yet they're not always captured effectively within current programming. Tools such as agri-stability are intended to provide whole farm income support during major shocks, but many producers experience meaningful income declines without triggering payments. Improving responsiveness will strengthen both participation and confidence, and I underscore that word confidence, in the program. Third, programs must remain flexible enough to reflect regional realities. Ag in Canada is highly diverse. Risk exposures differ between commodities, production systems, and certain regions as well. A one-size-fits-all approach limits effectiveness and reduces program uptake. That's why agri-stability needs adjustment to reflect commodity and regional differences, ensuring provinces retain flexibility to tailor delivery to regional needs that will strengthen outcomes for producers across the country. Fourth, BRM programming should support proactive risk management rather than create unnecessary admin burden. For example, proposals to link agri-invest participation more directly to environmental cost compliance risk duplicating practices that farmers already are implementing. Grain producers are leaders in environmental stewardship through measures such as zero-till adoption, precise agriculture, and soil carbon management. Programs should recognize these contributions rather than introduce requirements that reduce accessibility and effectiveness. Every season, grain farmers commit hundreds of thousands of dollars before they know what the markets are
you're going to be in trouble right off the hop. Can you just, you're over your 5 minutes, if you could just wrap it up really quickly, and Ms. Sauser should be giving you heck now.
So the decisions made in the study will shape that framework going forward for the FPD. The window to get this right is now. We are asking the committee to use it. Thank you, and we will be pleased to answer questions.
Great job. Thank you very much. We're just testing you to see how you're going to do on your first day. So far, so good. Now, I understand that, Mr. McLeod, your technical issues may have been resolved, so we're going to see how well this goes. So we're going to give you a whirl for up to 5 minutes, please, and we'll see if the interpretation is sufficient. So please go ahead.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr. Barlow, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Cedric McLeod, so representing the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association as Executive Director here. So we represent just over 72,000 producers in the country, representing just over 70 million plus acres of crop production across the country. While the acres are substantial, we continue to see the acres under production continue to decline due to a number of factors, largely due to the conversion of perennials to annual cropland, but we also see urban encroachment taking some of those acres. Native rangelands are the most endangered ecosystems globally, and Canada currently stewards just over 30 million acres of native rangelands that are potentially at risk of conversion. Public extension services continue to decline across Canada. As we know, this limits the access of forage producers to current program opportunities and agronomic support services. There are many recognized positive impacts of forage and grasslands on the economy and the environment, underpinning the dairy, beef, bison, sheep, and equine industries, as well as a supportive export industry. Beef prices are elevated and encouraging market growth with federal, provincial, and industry investment to help improve pasture management, productivity, and profitability for growers across Canada, for which we are thankful. However, forage and livestock producers carry higher production risks than annual crop producers typically and have fewer tools, insurance, and policy supports to manage risk, therefore exposing them to greater market volatility. Existing policy frameworks can move farmers towards annual cropping even when forage or pasture would be the better choice on the land base, simply from a risk management perspective. BRM policies must be leveled so farmers can choose what is best for their farm economically, environmentally, and socially, and not between perennial or annual crop production. Current policy realities: the disparity in coverage and functionality between forage and annual crop insurance programs requires perennial forage producers to assume far greater production risk. In some provinces, there are little to no forage or livestock insurance supports available, creating even greater incentive to convert from perennial or native grasslands to annual crop production where such supports do exist. Small to medium-sized mixed operations are even more heavily impacted by the risk management program and policy options available than larger operations, with new entrants to the grazing and forage sectors especially negatively impacted. Limited risk management tools are available to satisfy lenders' required level of security to advance working capital or provide long-term financing for land, cattle, and/or equipment purchases for the forage sector. There are recognized environmental negative impacts of conversion of native rangeland and long-term tame perennial pastures to annual crop production, as we see significant releases of carbon dioxide through the decomposition of soil organic matter, negative both to climate and environmental impact and to soil productivity, has been mentioned earlier. Considering reduced public extension services, the responsibility for timely and accurate knowledge translation and transfer, KTT services will increasingly fall to the responsibility of industry. With a surge of new entrants, farm succession and changeover happening in the next 20 years, KTT strategies will need to be developed to provide timely and relevant support to ensure resilience in forage cropping system and livestock grazing systems, as we heard from my colleague Vincent a few moments ago. Canadian agriculture continues to trail its global competitors in the adoption of advanced technology and management practices, with research capacity to support the Canadian forage sector continuing to decline. So recommended actions: develop a comprehensive risk management suite of programs to reduce risk for forage and pasture production and place forage on a level playing field with annual crop production systems, which is especially pertinent for small to medium-sized operations and/or new entrants. 2, develop tools and resources to provide forage growers a better opportunity to proactively manage risk using crop yield monitoring, on-farm data management, cost production analysis support through the development of a Canadian Forage Production Center of Excellence. And finally, invest in industry-led knowledge, translation, and transfer programs to ensure that graziers and forage producers are provided the most up-to-date production practice and technology adoption supports possible, ensuring the forage sector does not fall further behind the annual cropping sector from an innovation adoption perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. It's good that your technology is working. It's certainly important to have your input here as well. We will now turn to questions from the committee members. We will now go to Conservatives. Monsieur Gold, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Mr. O'Day. I would like to congratulate the organization for its excellent work over the last 25 years. I've always created a link between research, between producers, and anyway, I've participated in some of your activities, and it's always been a pleasure for me to be present there. And in my next life as a farmer, I'm sure I'll go back to that. I liked something you said in your speech about problems like in Deschambault, but particularly you emphasize researchers, and I think it's important. In a program of risk management, if we lose research that could lead to cultivars with 20% higher yield potential, that is part of risk management, but it would undoubtedly reduce the revenues in the medium to long term for producers if we don't do it. So could you go into the collateral damage of losing the expertise of those researchers?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Chair, there is always a link between research and what is actually done in the field. Sometimes it's a lengthy gap, and sometimes it's a short period. But of course, when we talk about developing new varieties, this is a long-term job which has an element of risk involved, and not everyone will do this. But above and beyond that, what we see and what we've seen with people working in research centers, the ones we referred to, is their ability to pass on their knowledge and the results of their research and to present those results to the people who will be implementing that. And in our case, it's important because we want to be aware of the most recent findings and technologies and the best practices to be used, and to shorten, to bring it as close as possible to producers so they can take advantage of that as soon as possible. So clearly for us, for the entire sector of forage plants in Quebec, we consider that this is an increased risk to have less access to the new knowledge and to lose that tie-in with the researchers that are close to us in the field and that are working in conditions where it'll enable our producers to move forward. And the loss of this link is very substantial and quite dramatic for the forage crops of Quebec. The forage crops are the poor cousin in research in Canada. Unfortunately, when we look at crops such as canola, soya, and corn, the private sector invests a lot because there's a lot of exports and economic spin-offs. But in forage crops, unfortunately, those producers grow forage crops for their own animals. And so there's no money necessarily coming in through those crops, but rather it's from the product resulting from the forage crops. And sometimes people lose sight of the importance of these forage crops in whether it's in the cattle sector or the sheep or the dairy sector. Could you go into greater depth on what you said on that? Clearly, placing a value or an amount on the value of perennial forage crops once they've been harvested and used within the same farm, because there's no actual financial transaction. It's true that to us in the Quebec Council of Forage Crops, we find that there's not enough research happening. There's not enough. We're missing some focus on that in order to move the whole industry to realize how much potential there can be, precisely because it hasn't been very well documented. Often it's not two separate businesses. The one farm, it will all be included within one farm. In other words, the fields are held by the same, within the same accounting system and the same accounting system as the entire farm. So how can one really attribute a good value to the forage crops? Closer, the best I could do would be to show you the half the hectares in Quebec, some 30% in Canada, are used for perennial forage crops, which are used to support the dairy industry, the cattle industry. I presented a few numbers on what that represents in Quebec and the sale of meat. And once those products are processed, what does it add to the economy? But underlying that, you have the forage crops, which generated that industry. In other words, we're starting out from land where there's nothing on it, then you grow something on it, and then that goes through a chain of production throughout the rest of the industry. Question. Climate change seems to be causing all of Canada and U.S. to have a drier climate. And when it is drier, then there are shortages of forage crops. It's important to develop varieties that will be able to face this shortage of water. So has any research been dedicated to that? And if it disappears, will it cause problems? Clearly so. It will raise issues for us. But not only research to develop new cultivars, but also sometimes the research deals with what's on the field and the connection between different species different crops that are subject to research. So there we're really dealing with something that's right down on in the field to study the juxtaposition of different species in order to get a good result and reduce to a minimum the amount of risk that can occur in a shortage of forage crops for a farm. So that's a section of the research that is very important to be done. Thank you, Mr. Odette. Thank you, sir.
Liberals, Madame Dandoran, for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. You've done a very good job with your new duties. Thank you for being with us today. Mr. Odette, I'm from the Eastern Townships region of Quebec, where we have a lot of forage crops and a lot of cattle and dairy cattle operations as well. So I'm very sensitive to what's going on right now in Sainte Foy, and I'm very interested in this type of research being able to continue at the Sherbrooke Research Centre in collaboration with other stakeholders. So it's an important topic that we will talk about for a long time to make sure that the expertise can be maintained. So in your comments, you said a lot about climatic risk. One of the main issues that I wonder about in the risk management program, the BRM program, is how can things be done to make farmers more resilient given these extreme climate events that succeed one another quicker and quicker. In other words, pay out every time there's a drought, or how could these programs be used to provide better support? And this raises the question as to whether we have business risk management programs that deal with issues that are structural or exceptional. The BRM programs are supposed to be for exceptional events, but now we have the impression that they're becoming more recurrent situations. So how do you approach that? Well, it's clear that in order to provide good support to our farmers so that they don't hesitate to take on the risk of having more hectares of pasture land in their farm, right from the planting through to the harvest, it's important because we ensure the harvest now, but other issues can come up ahead of that. So you have to be aware that when a farmer decides or chooses to increase the number of hectares or reduce them, then the risk of establishing a new plantation has an effect on their decision. They may think, if I plant a greater area here, I'm at risk of losing it. Maybe I'm safer if I put a different crop there instead. So they'll try to have a tighter approach based on the number of hectares that are already being used for forage crops, and then they expose themselves to more risk. So the way they manage the initial risk is probably a good start. And then after that, to really value each hectare that's already planted for forage crops, that can make a difference, because if one chooses to add an increased number of hectares, then one is more likely to end up with a surplus. So what do you do with the surplus afterwards? If we have surpluses that we cannot market because the entire region is running a surplus, then the crops, especially humid crops, there's a matter of transportation, and they have to build, producers can build their own strategic reserves, or an overall watch, province-wide or nationwide, would a crisis watch system could check if there's a surplus in one region and a shortage in another region, then we ought to be able to shift those surpluses. And it's not effective or efficient because sometimes you have heavy, humid hay that isn't as easy to transport, but if someone needs it, they may really need it, and it could be a disaster for another farm that doesn't have the forage crops and that needs it. So it can make a difference sometimes between deciding to sell their cattle or quite simply reducing their herd a little to adapt. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want our herd to be reduced because that's our food self-sufficiency and our use of the land and there are farms in all different regions that participate in the local economy. And when those regions lose part of their herd, then the agricultural economy hurts. So encouraging the maintaining of surpluses would be the beginnings of a strategy where afterwards it would be possible to shift them around throughout the territory. Mr. Burrows, if I were to ask you the same question, the reality of annual plants is not the same, and you also face those climate changes, the extreme climate shifts. So what can we do to ensure that our programs continue to be exceptional, but also support long-term resiliency? Thank you, ma'am.
That's a great question, and I agree with much with what was just said. And I would say that two things. I think one, from a climate change perspective, weather. Obviously, agri-insurance programs are fundamentally designed to address yield losses caused by weather, and so climate change fits into that. But we're now living in a world of extremes, and certainly now, indirectly, we're looking at other program expansions potentially to address climate change, as you asked me, and whole farm income protection against indirectly these things becomes important. Trade disruptions, classic example. If you were to take, for example, the Panama Canal, which is drying up, that's potentially and already has led to a lot of disruption and time delays in terms of ships getting through that canal. And then that causes secondary impacts ultimately for delivery products related to the farm. So, I think that's an example where we need to ensure that we have programs that going forward that focus on responsiveness and accessibility. I don't know, Kate, do you want to add to that?
Yeah,
Kate,
just a big
sorry,
theme. Sorry, go ahead.
you're over by about 30 seconds,
Okay.
so maybe you can fill that in when you get another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Now, Monsieur Lamour, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Odette, thank you for being here. And I listened to the answers given regarding the need for hay, for example, when climate events occur. We experienced that in Abitibi West. In fact, a perfect storm of drought, forest fires, and freezing. And I work closely with producers, particularly in a process called Lettre Rouge, to try to alert the agriculture minister to better deploy the agricultural programs. Of course, they passed the buck back and forth between Quebec and Ottawa, and it didn't really provide the results we hoped for because the programs were not triggered. Even though there was a clear drought and even if there was a perfect storm, the programs did not trigger. And this is a major issue. What kind of solution can you see for that? Because the end result in the financial statements that I was shown by one of those farmers are that adjustments are going to cost more to the producers, particularly when it comes to the exchange of needs in terms of hay, because they have to bring it in from somewhere else in the region, and then the shipping costs are exorbitant, and this is not well covered by the agri programs. So I'd like to hear you on that, and I have a lot of sub-questions as well. Thank you. Well, I'm not the specialist on crop insurance, but what I do see when I speak with farmers is precisely what you said. We hear that the program is not being triggered in spite of a situation that comes up. And often what I'm being told is that often crop insurance is more regional rather than individual when it comes to the forage crops. This is perhaps one of the underlying causes of the problem. After that, how can we, when I answered the question from the MP earlier, to have a watch system which is ready to respond when a problem comes up, it would be a solution. I'm thinking of the UPA drought operation, which they organized back around 2021-22, when they shifted a lot of forage across the province. and one has to be ready to respond to concrete situations like this that come up, a contingency plan or something that's triggered rapidly. Because even if the crop insurance is triggered, well, you still have to find forage, and you have to be able to ship it from where it's available towards those farms that need it. And there you have the transportation costs, of course, and all of that has to be arranged. And then if we talk about something that can be solved at the provincial level, fine, that's one thing. But when you have forage in one province and you have to ship them to another province, then you need coordination at the federal level. So if we have to get the railway involved, or we have to get other modes of transportation involved that are more efficient to move large volumes of crops, then the farmers feel helpless. And as a producer, what can you do? Talk to the railway to try to get a train to transport the crops. It's something that is not really done on an individual basis. So it's something to think through already, a contingency plan or a system that could enable us to respond quickly and to move the forage from where it's available to where it's needed. I think this would go above and beyond the insurance aspect and be a way of managing risk and the risk of reduction in herds. Thank you. You answered several of my sub-questions. Also, there's the fact that rarity increases prices, and that has an even greater impact on the farmer involved. On another line of thinking, the government says that there are two programs: agri-innovation for commercialization, demonstration, and adoption of agri-science technology for pre-marketing activities or research activities. How do those programs adapt as far as your reality is concerned right now? How suitable are they? Go ahead. No, but I want to say that as regards, I can't really answer. I'm sorry to say that, but I can't really give you an intelligent answer to your question. I would like to be able to. As regards agri-science, unfortunately, it's not eligible for university or academic institutions. They have to have a partner. What do you think about collaboration with the academic sector? Well, earlier I talked about our colleagues who are working in research and in the academic environment. We've seen recently, we were struck to what extent we were struck by how few people were involved within the universities regarding forage crops, which to us is a problem, considering that is a crop which covers half of the acreage of Quebec. It's not normal to have so few people involved in research in the universities in support of the people that are getting training in order to raise the level and continue to move forward the expertise. It's essential that the universities should have more professors and more researchers to support training for new agronomists and training for all the new professionals that come out to support our producers. So if we have the knowledge and the experts available to come out to the field to support our farmers, then clearly it would reduce the risk and it would reduce the potential for problems that will come up with forage crops. So we need more knowledge, more expertise in the universities and in the educational institutions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Odette.
We'll now go to back to the Conservatives for Mr. Epp for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Present APF has got 5 pillars to it, and we're hearing from witnesses the importance, obviously, of the BRM pillar. We've studied the closure of the ag research stations. That's another one of the pillars that's broadly supported, and those closures are being rued. We've heard about the impacts to the forage sector. Let me ask each organization to get on the record, do we favor cross-compliance from other sectors that perhaps aren't as broadly supported over to the BRM sector? Let's start with the Grain Growers of Canada.
I could turn over to Kate.
I'll ask for short answers here. I want to get through a lot of material.
Sure. I'll short answer for you. Thank you for your question. I feel as though grain farmers already do lead so many stewardship practices. So that environmental tie and that cross-compliance risk perhaps just adds more duplication for existing efforts that are already being done by grain farmers.
Thank you. Mr. McLeod online.
Yeah, echo similar comments. The environmental contribution of the forage sector is substantial from a soil health, water quality, water management, landscape functionality perspective. So, yeah, no, agreed.
Monsieur Day.
As Mr. McLeod said, each of the goals of the different agro-environmental plans are affected by forage crops, and a large contribution can be done by perennial forage crops toward our environmental goals.
BRM. Agri-insurance has been widely supported, particularly by land-based crops. I know the forages have historically been difficult to insure by our provincial agencies because of the intersection of yield and quality and its link therefore to value. Do you have any specific recommendations to get at a better insurance provisions for forage? And if not, would a margin-based insurance program, where often the forages are walked off the farm in the form of livestock or sold, if that was responsive and timely and bankable, would that address the concerns, or do specific agri-insurance improvements need to be made? We'll start with Mr. Audet.
I'm not sure if you can really place a value, if placing a value on the forage is really the key to that. Our producers know what their needs are. They simply want to reduce the risk that they face when they set their crops or the prairie, the pasture, when they determine the feed requirements for the season. We try to place a value, or at least to get some reference for the value, but it's very difficult to do.
Leave it at that.
Mr. McLeod.
McLeod, sorry.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Yes. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I agree. Margin-based insurance would certainly help. I think we need to place more emphasis on understanding our forage cost of production and using technology to track our yields. There should be more incentive to track yields, because I agree 100% with your thoughts, Mr. App. If we had better yield tracking and quality tracking, we'd be much better attuned to what we can do from an insurance perspective. Tracking our rainfall more effectively on the farm, moisture, soil moisture, content tracking, and utilizing new technologies like satellite imagery, which help us to give biomass yield. Calibrating those systems, I think, will go a long ways to helping us with that forage yield data that we really need to bring us on par with annual cropping systems.
To the grain growers, the Prime Minister has declared our relationship with the U.S. at the moment a weakness, and yet to the India and China tariff our grains. What's the level of tariff from the U.S. on our grains, to the grain sector, please?
Aware of any particular tariff that's affecting us?
So the crop insurance or the agri-insurance seems to address the yield risks, the climate risks that are faced on the farm, and yet there are still trade risks, the ag sector, not so much from our American cousins to the south, but from our overseas, and that has disrupted, obviously, our pulses in other areas. So let's get to margin insurance, to agri-stability, where there seems to be a lot of the issues. What improvements would you have? Because that's where price is impacted. What improvements would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean,
You got about 30 seconds if you can.
Yeah, agri-insurance is working well and should remain the foundation of our BRM programs, no question. The tariff issue is sort of a going forward risk concern vis-a-vis the states. And perhaps, Kate, you could just mention ag stability a little bit.
Yeah, I'll go quick. I think BRM should be looked at as an economic strategy. We are a $45 billion export sector. So rather than support payments, it should more be looked at an economic strategy to help mitigate those losses.
Thank you very much. Now to Mr. Connors for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Once again, welcome to all the witnesses. Glad that you could participate. And I'm going to start with Cedric McLeod and ask him a question. And I think I'll ask Mr. Burrows this question, the same question. Both of you mentioned proactive risk management or proactively managing risk. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And you could probably bring in a little bit about how agri-stability could be improved in the new suite of programs in order to address some of this issue?
Well, yes, thanks, Mr. Connor, for the question. I think Mr. Odette, in his comments about forage excess and managing that comes into play here. It is difficult to move forage around. It's a bulky product, especially for moving, silage type products, very heavy, right, very wet. It's hard to be efficient that way. But incentivizing growers to look at risk management in terms of being able to tuck product away during good years so that it can be drawn on in lean years would be something to look at. Of course, there's a significant cost that goes along with that, with maintaining that inventory. So that's something to be considered, but it has long been a risk management tool used by livestock producers in Canada, across North America, globally. So incorporating some of those inventory based incentives into agri-stability may be something to be looking at. I think the other thing to look at, from a proactive risk management strategy, has been mentioned before. A lot of our forage insurance programs in Canada are actually rainfall insurance. And, depending on where the weather stations are reporting from, it may not be reporting accurately because it is by a region. So an individual grower within that region, may be short, didn't get that cloudburst, right? So it's really quite inconsistent. So moving, as I said earlier, to some different models and others, we're looking at satellite imagery for biomass accumulation. Understanding and reporting, right? And we can see that over time. So we can be proactive as we see, the year isn't progressing as well as we would like to. We can start to look at some of the strategies Mr. Odette had mentioned about moving things around, as well as, tracking moisture content, soil moisture content, which has been shown to be an excellent indicator of forage yield. So these things are on the horizon. I think pulling those predictive models into our thought process, as well as looking at risk long-term and inventory management are two things I would say.
Thank you. Mr. Burrows, do you have anything to add, or would you like to have a comment?
And as I indicated earlier, it's reforms to agri-stability are all essentially about, a greater focus on accessibility and responsiveness and keeping a close eye on income changes really is what it comes down to. Kate, do you have anything you really want to add substantially?
Yeah, for sure. I think with agri-stability, the main problem is that there's not a huge participation, and that's because the responsiveness level is quite low. So having that improving of responsiveness would increase participation, showing that agri-stability could cover trade loss for cash flow problems, because farmers can't always float over an 18th month payment when they're getting substantial losses on the farm.
Thank you. Mr. Odette, I'm not sure, I think I got a minute or so here. Would you be able to elaborate on what when you spoke about, and Mr. McLeod just mentioned it, your capacity to produce surpluses in good years, and exactly what that would mean and how the BRM program could help it?
Well, what I mean by je m'adresse en anglais ou en français, comme je veux. D'accord. Je vais y aller en français.
Okay, I'll answer in French. So, producing surpluses, well, the first line of defense for our farmers is to have a certain minimum level of forage available, and always to have a bit extra. That's security that can be managed locally. But as Mr. McLeod stated, there are costs connected with that. So supporting producers who adopt best practices and always have a surplus available to manage those times when there could be a shortage, that's a major plus. And this would also bring us to, on a broader basis, not necessarily just locally, it would provide a capacity to use those extra amounts elsewhere. That's a first line of defense, but there are costs connected with it. And not necessarily all producers are ready to cover those costs of having those surpluses or maintaining unnecessary extra inventory. Thank you, Mr. Odette.
Colleagues, because we started about 15 minutes late, I want to make sure Mr. Lemire has his last 2.5 minutes, but I do want to, if we can go to that last two. So are we okay to go another 12, 13 minutes? Is that okay with our witnesses? Okay, we'll be fine. Mr. Lemire, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your leadership on the issue of parity. It's important. So for Mr. Burrows, I'd like to hear you on the issue of transportation costs. I would like to give an example. 38 tons of grain from Abitibi-Témiscamingue will cost $2,500 to $3,200. But in the same trip down to the south of Quebec would be between $700 or $800. How can we better support the work of farmers producing grain and the efficiency of that in remote areas? I'll give the example. I gave an example in Quebec, but it would apply to all the provinces.
Well, I think certainly remote service and in particular remote pricing, which is what you're really focusing on. Service is perhaps not so much of a concern these days. Pricing, yes, I understand what you're saying, remote pricing. And, one of the options that's being discussed a lot, and it will continue to be an issue, would be ensuring that we bring more competition into the rail system. And, there are ways of doing that. Yes, you can potentially expand the interswitching zones to allow, another carrier where you're in these remote locations. And by remote locations, you're really saying there's only one rail provider, right? And that's where the concern is, and you want to invoke more competition, and that's something we will continue in general to focus on, no question.
Est-ce que vous avez des recommandations?
Do you have any recommendations along that line or examples how new sustainable agricultural partnerships could assist in responding to those needs for fairness in transportation costs from region to region?
Well, I think, our grain farmers in particular have been working closely with the railways, and I think there's a pretty cooperative spirit that goes on. I think, I think sharing information and data and service responsiveness, and I think, we're increasingly, or have for a number of years, improved as a result of that dialogue, better share of data, and where are the blocks in the system. That really is the prime focus. I'm taking a Western perspective now in terms of the dialogue, the impacts on infrastructure, where are the bottlenecks. Port of Vancouver, we have a very big major project bottleneck with a bridge. That's really the burning, I think, transportation issue that we're most focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows. I'm going to have to keep everybody tight as the bells are ringing now, so we'll go to Mr. Bonk for 5 minutes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry. We need unanimous consent to get our last two questions. Is everybody okay with that? Carry on. Mr. Bonk for 5 minutes, please.
All right, thank you. We've heard a lot today about business risk management in Canada and our agriculture sector and the importance of research. And everyone's been mentioning research as far as genetics and how we can improve the crops that we have. And I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more on the forage side of for example, by increasing the amount of forage that we have on our land, we're basically doubling the carbon sink if we can double the amount of forage we produce. It's one of the most climate responsible things we can do. And maybe the question I'm going to ask to everyone is, you all represent organizations that represent on-the-ground farmers that are actually working in the field. Can you tell me what are some of the positive things that your members have said about the closures of the research centers? Anyone from any organization? Okay, that's exactly what we're hearing. That's exactly what we're hearing in this committee as well. The Prime Minister said the country that can't feed itself or defend itself has few options, and it's a funny way to try to feed this country when we're actually stopping the one thing that's going to help us to increase production. And let's just talk a little bit more on the forage side at the moment. So why do you think there's such a poor uptake on business risk management programs on the forage sector? And I'll ask Mr. Audette. Yeah.
I I think the first reason why people don't adhere to the system, don't subscribe to the system now, it's based on rainfall, and people would like to be able to assure their yield. There are huge differences between the yield from one farm to another, and I think that farmers nowadays would like to be able to protect the yield within their own specific farm.
Would you suggest? Mr. McLeod.
I think some more active yield, tracking year over year, and some support for growers to do that would go a long ways to help us to be able to understand what that variability is year in, year out. I think yield monitoring technology is fairly ubiquitous within the grains and oilseed sector. To their credit and their benefit, we're seeing some of those technologies starting to move forward. In the forage sector as well. So I think we need to embrace that. And as I said in my comments, we tend to lag behind the world in terms of technology and innovation adoption here in Canada. So I think some push on some digital tech that helps us to track yield will go a long ways to help us to achieve the goals that Mr. Adet just mentioned. But I also think that looking at structurally how agri-stability works, say for a mixed operation, right? You got grain and cattle, and those tend to offset one another. So in a lot of cases, mixed farms tend to be self-insuring. If we can look at how do we break out that forage production itself from the overall enterprise, which, at CFJ, that's something we're really trying to advance, to look at the cattle enterprise, with a forage focus and with a cattle focus, and making sure you can tease the two out, because it does make a big difference in the end in how we can and seek to ensure the forage crop specifically.
So have you seen a huge impact when it comes to the closure of these research centers? And I'll say that in context of when we're increasing the amount of forage that we can produce on the land, and what it'll do is increase the organic matter in the soil, which will increase water infiltration, which will help mitigate some of these issues. Are you seeing an end to the research that's being done on that subject, Mr. McLeod?
Yeah, so obviously a challenge, and we heard it earlier from the witnesses in the first panel. The loss of those germplasm in those development programs, of course, long term, that is going to have an impact, right? And somehow we're going to need to keep those breeding programs moving forward. The other thing I would say, Mr. Bonk, as I said in my opening comments, we need an active extension service in this country to support forage producers and moving up that pedigree seed list so that we're getting the best genetics being deployed at field scale as possible. And then we have the agronomic support to carry that product through and make sure we're maximizing the genetic potential of the species and cultivars we're putting down. As we've eroded our extension services, we've eroded our training programs at university. Forages tend to be the first ones to go. But as you say, they are the cornerstone of sustainability, whether biodiversity and carbon storage in Canadian agriculture. So we're really behind the eight ball when we're closing research stations.
And thank you, Mr. Bach. Our final round to Madame Chatel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci à...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for having been here today for this important topic. So, the risk management programs, to improve them, specifically the Agri-Stability Program. It's very interesting what you've said to assist with that. Do you feel comfortable in submitting in writing your specific recommendations for this program? And I would like to ask each of you to continue with what was said in the first panel. In other words, we have risk management programs, but they need to be reformed in such a way as to manage risk or mitigate risk. And adding aspects for the deployment of these or implementation of these programs, or to finance them, that would encourage farmers to subscribe to practices that would help manage the risk in order to avoid some of these issues. I would like to hear each of you on that. starting with Mr. McLeod, please.
Certainly. Thanks for the question. And one of the things that we've been actively working on at CFG over the last several years is building networks of extension professionals that can extend this kind of information. And certainly working with our colleagues in the beef, dairy, sheep, bison sectors, we've got to get this information in palatable form out to the growers and help them with the paperwork burden. That's one of the challenges we're seeing. There's so many programs and so many levels of supports that the paperwork burden can actually be a barrier. So we're really working on building those networks of folks that can work one-on-one with the growers to make sure that they are seeking and accessing these programs.
Earlier, one panelist mentioned the possibility of transforming some of these programs into tax credits in order to cut down on the red tape. And Mr. McLeod, just briefly, do you find that an interesting approach?
Always interested in exploring options that that can streamline things from a red tape perspective, and certainly, you know, with beef prices being where they are, and growers being in a more profitable situation, it may be an avenue to look at. At this point, I think I would lean towards more interaction and more extension service to get the information out to the growers, but always willing to look at options.
Beaucoup, Monsieur Audet, et ensuite Monsieur Bureau, Madame Saucer.
Thank you, Mr. Odette and Mr. Bose and Ms. Saucer. To encourage producers to have the tools they need to manage risk. Clearly, there's a need for adaptation, but there's one thing we did not touch on, which is perhaps the rewarding people for good practices. We talked about tax credits, and there are various ways of approaching that. But what could be interesting is when a producer provides services to society, which agriculture is asked to do a lot nowadays at all levels for all areas of production. They make major efforts to participate in the collective effort to improve our environment and to reduce risks connected with climate change. So this is also a path to sell a service, an ecosystem service for our producers. That could be interesting. Thank you. Even perhaps in the form of a reimbursable tax credit. Mr. Burrows?
There's some interesting ideas percolating away, and Kate, perhaps you could just reinforce that.
Yeah, we haven't quite explored tax credits with our members, but our main focus, which we will submit in writing to you, Ms. Chattel, as well, is protecting that crop insurance aspect, as it does prove to be very effective for our farmers, along with fixing that agri-stability responsiveness, because as a farmer myself, we just had no fallback when we had that canola disruption. Also, just maintaining flexibility across regions, because as we know, nothing's one size fits all from BC to Quebec to the East Coast, right? And lastly, just making sure programs are focused on the actual risk itself, not necessarily the compliance.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Oui, juste rapidement, Monsieur Audet.
Thank you very much. Just briefly, Mr. Odette, the implementation of the agri-insurance program and agri-protection is really for, well, crop insurance in Quebec. You're saying that you want an individual program. Do you have some recommendations if we have time? As I said earlier, I'm not in a position to make a specific recommendation today because I'm not a specialist in insurance, but definitely our colleagues and partners are very interested in that subject, and we could certainly get in touch with them in order for them to be able to share their ideas. Thank you, Mr. Odette.
Colleagues, thank you very much for our witnesses for sticking around for an extra few minutes. I think it was important that we had the opportunity to hear your insights on this issue, certainly. But we've got a vote, so I will, the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting. Adjourned. Thank you.
Merci à l'équipe de traduction. Merci.